Hello YouTube. I'm going to talk about marriage, what Jesus said about marriage. This video is really for Bev. I said that I would explain you why I say the things I say, and this video is the explanation. Got my tea, and I've also got an energy drink, and I'm going to try and do one hit, and I'm going to try and do it as quickly as I can without missing any important details. So, there are a lot of things that could be said on marriage from the Bible. We could talk about its symbolism, the way it's a picture of Christ and the church. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard people say that before. There's all of that stuff, but we're not going to talk about that. And we could talk about how marriage works internally according to the New Testament. So, what is the role of the husband? What does the wife do? How do they relate? That kind of thing. But we're not going to talk about that. So I'm just going to talk about marriage as covenant. That's it, nothing else. So when people get married, what are they getting themselves into according to Jesus? Yeah, that's our topic. What starts a marriage? What ends a marriage? What does Jesus say about divorce? What did Jesus say about remarriage after divorce? Yeah. Jesus talks 4 times in the Gospels about marriage, divorce and remarriage. I don't know, did you know that? 4 times in the Gospels. And I don't know what it's like where you are, but over here, there are all sorts of books about all sorts of relationship things. You know, should Christians date? Should Christians kiss before marriage? How far can people go before marriage? Are dating sites okay? All this kind of stuff, and it goes on and on. And books are written, pastors preach on it, there are seminars, yeah? But none of that stuff is from the Bible. It's not mentioned one single time. Yet it gets talked about really a lot, doesn't it? Even something that all Christians would agree on, like pornography, and I'm not saying that's right, that isn't really mentioned either. Okay, some people might think Matthew 5, but they might need to read Matthew 5 again. Definitely wrong. Talked about, but not mentioned, not talked about specifically by Jesus on 4 occasions in the Gospels. Yeah. So there's a load of stuff that we hear about all the time, but something that Jesus taught on 4 times, I've never really heard a whole sermon on it, not once in 20 years. Yeah. And I think the reason for that is that what Jesus taught is very, very difficult pastorally. I don't think it's hard to understand what he's saying, but the implications are difficult. Yeah. This, by the way, this is why you must read the Bible for yourself, because there are things that most pastors just will not teach on. This isn't the only thing, by the way. Okay, don't rely on other people or commentaries or a pastor to fill you in about what's going on. You need to read the Bible for yourself. And when we read it, we need to separate understanding what the text is saying from the pastoral implications. Otherwise, what happens is we're going to be tempted to reinterpret the text to avoid the pastoral difficulties, yeah? So we need to understand the text first, then work out the application, yeah? I'll say a bit more about the pastoral stuff later, but I just want to point out that it gets very messy. So, because there are so many scenarios, yeah. So, it's one thing when we're talking about two unmarried Christians, but what about a Christian married to a non-Christian? What about someone who was divorced before becoming a Christian? What if someone was divorced or remarried before becoming a Christian? Yeah, and all of that assumes a single Christian definition of marriage. What about marriages in other cultures? Yeah, they're totally different. So, for example, an Islamic marriage is nothing like a Christian one. Yeah, they have a divorce clause built in, and polygamy is built in as a possibility. So, what about people who are, let's say, Islamically married? Yeah. So it becomes the application becomes insanely complicated. Okay, we'll look at verses in a minute. When I read them, some things to just notice. He's talking to his disciples, and I think Jesus is giving us the ideal. He's giving us the ideal. At one point he says, God allowed something with Moses that wasn't his ideal, but Jesus comes to restore things to how they were at the beginning. So he gives us God's original intention for marriage, if you like. Yeah, that's what he's doing. So we don't need to worry too much about the pastoral implication. We just want to understand what the text is saying, what Jesus is saying, and I think he's painting the ideal. It's not an instruction manual. He's not saying, in this eventuality, if someone was a Christian, before they were a Christian, they were divorced from an Islamic marriage. What's the situation? He's not giving us an instruction manual. He's just laying out God's blueprint for marriage. Okay, so the four texts are right. Luke 16 verse 18, Mark 10 verse 12, a section of Matthew 5, and a section of Matthew 19. Matthew 19 is the longest, so we'll do that last and in more detail. Okay, so number 1, Luke 16 verse 18, and I will put a link below this video in the text box down there. And this is from the New King James Version. And if you can open link and follow along with me to make sure that it is as I say it is. Okay, just one verse. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. That's it. Right. Notice something. It's the remarriage that's the issue, not the divorce. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And you are going to find that with the other scriptures also. It's the remarriage which is adulterous. Okay? Because a lot of times you hear people say things like, oh, should someone stay with an abuser, someone who's violent or has a drug problem or whatever? Are you saying they can't get divorced? Well, they don't need to stay with them. Just don't marry someone else. Because that would be to commit adultery. And again, same thing. Just on this verse, even if they have never married, So I've been single all my life. For me to marry a divorced woman would be to commit adultery. Yeah? So it's not like she did something wrong back in the day by getting divorced, but I'm okay to marry her. Yeah? No. Whoever marries her, who is divorced from her husband, commits adultery. It's very clear. Yeah? Now, if your brain right now is going into pastoral mode, if you're thinking about this person or that person, stop. Don't do that. Yeah? We got to understand the text as it is, okay? And the implications come later when we've understood what Jesus is saying. Yeah? Okay. One last thing on this verse, very important. You will notice there's no exception, okay? Just note that, okay? No exceptions, okay? Right. Verse, text, scripture number 2. Okay, Mark 10, verses 2 to 12. Okay, a section of Mark, did I say? Anyway, okay, there's a link, Mark 2 to 12, there's a link down there. Please read along. The Pharisees came and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" testing him. And he answered them and said, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." And Jesus answered them and said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." In the house, his disciples also asked him again about this same matter. So he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Okay. So the conversation, it's really hot here today. So the conversation begins with the Pharisees, but ends in the house with only the disciples. Yeah. The Pharisees come to Jesus with the fact that under the law, under Moses in the Old Testament, divorce was permissible. And Jesus says something quite remarkable, actually, I think, if you apply it to life in general, that this provision of the law was the best God could do at the time because of the hardness of their hearts. How about that? Sometimes it's the best that God can do in the situation. There's some theology there somewhere. Anyway, but what Jesus makes clear, the important point is that the law falls short of God's intention. And there are other places in the Gospels where Jesus says that observing the Mosaic law falls short of God's standard, even if you were to keep it perfectly. Matthew 5, for example. But Christians have a new heart and a new spirit that is not under law and outworks a righteousness that exceeds the law and matches the character of God. Matthew 5. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So Jesus restates, in his response to the Pharisees, Jesus is restating Genesis chapter 2 as God's intention for marriage. Agree? Yeah? The pattern is leave father and mother, be joined to wife, and he says that God is the one that does the joining. By the way, there's no ceremony for marriage in the Bible. Okay, that's it. That's the definition, just that. Yeah? God does the joining, and what God has joined together, let no man separate. What does that mean? Let no man separate. Clearly, the disciples weren't sure, because later on, probably not to appear foolish in front of the Pharisees, they asked Jesus again in the house, later. And then Jesus just comes out and says it super clear. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Notice, same thing as last time, and marries another. That's the issue, that's the adultery right there. And again, no exceptions. Okay, no exceptions. Three, Matthew 5, verses 31 and 32. Link below, please read along. Oh, this is King James, not New King James, regular King James. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the case of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever marries her that is divorced, committeth adultery. Okay. So, really, almost the same again, with a slight difference in the wording. It says, causes her to commit adultery. Divorcing your wife causes her to commit adultery. And I think Jesus is making a point here that even though remarriage is the issue, that is where the adultery happens. In a time when most women were poor and had no independent income, a divorced woman would need to get remarried just to survive. Yeah? And so he's saying that even if the man only divorced his wife, he is in a sense responsible for her remarriage as well, because it would be unavoidable for her. Yeah? Anyway, I don't think that's particularly important. What you will probably have noticed is there is an exception clause. For any reason except fornication. Or some Bible translations have for any reason except sexual immorality. Okay, Mark and Luke didn't have an exception. Matthew does. Actually, Matthew has it both times. Here in Matthew 5 and also in Matthew 19, and the wording's identical. Notice that the exception is for fornication, not adultery, okay? Because it's very common to hear people say, oh, there's an exception for adultery. So if you're unfaithful in a marriage, then the marriage is over. It doesn't say that, okay? Pro tip pro tip. If you ever want to know what the Greek is, okay, go to this website, blueletterbible.org. Link below. Go to blueletterbible.org, put your verse in, click on interlinear. Yeah, and it's going to give you the Greek next to the English. Yeah. So there is a word for adultery in Greek, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Moihao, I think is how you say it. That isn't the word that's used here. The word used is porneia. The word in the exception clause is porneia. And porneia is all sexual immoral activity, including premarital sex. Okay, remember that. Yeah. That's the exception. Porneia. All sexual immorality, including premarital sex. A bit more tea. How long have I been talking? Let's have a look. Wow. Okay. Scripture number 4, Matthew 19. This is the longest chunk. This is Jesus' longest teaching on marriage, divorce, or remarriage. You'll notice this is almost certainly, I'm just going to say, it is the same event as Mark. Yeah. The link is below. Please read along. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command, give a certificate of divorce and put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, except for porneia, and marries another, commits adultery, moihao. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." Okay. Just some preliminary comments. It's not absolutely clear to me who they are in verse 7 and in verse 8. I think it's the disciples. It doesn't really matter, I don't think. Once again, we have the exception clause, except for porneia. So this exception clause, what does this exception clause mean? What's this all about? Can you break a marriage if your partner has done something sexually immoral? I don't know. looking at pornography, reading those trashy women's books? I don't think so. Okay, because I don't think there is an exception here at all. Okay, there is no exception here. Not to us anyway. Not in the way that we understand things. Yeah. I will show you it. I will show you from the Bible. I'm not gonna do Jack and Ori tell me a story, retro narrative, right? I'm gonna show you from the Bible. But here's a thought, okay? Right, the Gospel of Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. You will notice when you read it, it has far more references and allusions to the Old Testament than the other Gospels. There's an emphasis on fulfilled prophecy, yeah, that it might be fulfilled according to which was spoken by the prophets. Classic Matthew. There's more dialogue with scribes and Pharisees, and Matthew's much harder on the scribes and the Pharisees. Yeah. Anyway, you can Google it. I'm saying that Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, was written to a Jewish audience. The other Gospels were not. Okay? And Jews had a formal engagement process. Okay? I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show it to you from the Bible. I'm going to show it to you from the very same book that has the exceptions, Matthew. Yeah? Chapter 1. Yeah? Verses 18 to 19. Right. Some translations, unfortunately, make it difficult to see the parallel because they use different words, different English words, when translating the same Greek word. Yeah? But the ESV is good this time. Today, the ESV is good because it doesn't do that. It translates words consistently. Link is below. Matthew, chapter 1, 18 and 19. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit, and her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. Yeah? It says divorce. But they weren't married. Or they weren't married in the sense that we understand marriage. Okay? That word there in Matthew 1 verse 19, that is the same word in Matthew 19 verse 9. Joseph was going to divorce Mary because of sexual immorality, because of porneia. Do you see now why it's porneia? It's not adultery because then they haven't consummated yet. They're not married in the way that we understand it. It's not a consummated marriage. Porneia includes premarital sex. Yeah, Mary was pregnant. Joseph thought, she's fornicated. Okay? That's the situation. They're betrothed. And Joseph is going to break the betrothal. He's going to divorce her. Okay? And the author of Matthew says, yeah, that would be fine. That's not a problem. It says Joseph was a righteous man. It was a righteous thing. Yeah. If you look at Blue Letter Bible, you're gonna see Matthew 1, Matthew 5, Matthew 19. The word is the same word in the Greek, divorce. Yeah. So that's the exception. That's what Matthew is saying. I believe this is what it means. Matthew's saying you can divorce during the betrothal for fornication. You can break off an engagement. Yeah. Not divorce in the sense that we understand it, a specific Jewish thing. That's why it's not in the other Gospels and it's only in Matthew. And Matthew chapter 1 has the exception, and then the exception's repeated. So actually, in the United States and the UK, I'm not absolutely sure about definitely in the UK, in the early 20th century, so a long, long time ago, an engagement was a legal contract as well. It was a legal contract, and you couldn't break it just for anything. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. We haven't done that for a long time. Anyway, yeah. So I think Jesus' teaching is consistent. I think there's no exception apart from death. Yeah. And I think actually that's what Jesus is saying at the end of Matthew 19. So let's have a look again at Matthew 19, because there's a kind of strange ending, talking about eunuchs and things like that. What's that about? I think Jesus is saying again just the same thing that he's said already. So let me read it. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only to those whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. The New King James and a few other Bibles unhelpfully insert a heading between verse 10 and verse 11. And that heading is typically celibacy or something like that. Now, I'm sure you know, but I'll say it anyway. Headings, chapter numbers, verse numbers, these are not part of the original documents and were added much, much later. In fact, the headings are just inserted by translators, and they're different in every Bible, even today, okay? So all of that stuff, we ignore that. We don't need to worry about that, yeah? The reason they put the heading in there is because they want to detach 11 and 12 from the rest of the conversation. But you can see clearly it's the same conversation, yeah? I think a lot of people read this, maybe because of Roman Catholic priests being lifelong celibates. I'm not sure, yeah? But a lot of people tend to read this and they detach the last two verses from the rest. And it's become a thing now. And you've got Bibles sticking this heading in now because, well, that's the way people read it. So be careful of Bible translators, okay? Because they will give you an interpretation. And who knows if they're right or not. Yeah? Jesus said to them, "Whoever marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And the disciples say, "That's hard. Maybe it's better not to get married." And Jesus says, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given." He's still on topic, okay? The subject hasn't changed. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Why would you make yourself as a eunuch? Because remarriage is adultery. Yeah, he just said that, right? Like 2 verses earlier. Right? People want to make this verse about lifelong celibacy. They want to detach it from the rest of the conversation and make it about something different. But clearly, the context, the whole thing he's been talking about is divorce and remarriage. Divorce and remarriage is adultery. The disciples say that's too hard. Jesus says, for the kingdom of God, people will remain single. Okay. That's basically everything that Jesus said. We've covered it all. Get back to me with questions. Paul said some stuff in 1 Corinthians 7. But I'll tell you what, whatever Paul says there, if it contradicts what Jesus said, then something is wrong in the understanding department. Yeah? Really, I should talk about 1 Corinthians 7 as well. But this has already gone on way too long. Pastorally, it's messy, yeah, because of there are so many permutations. People have baggage. People become Christians on their third marriage or something like that. Like I said at the beginning, I don't think Jesus is giving us a how-to manual. That's not what he's doing. He's laying out God's design for marriage, the ideal. Yeah, this is God's ideal. But you're single, you've never been married, so you don't have baggage, you don't have these issues. Yeah, for you pastorally, it's simple. I don't know if you found what I've said shocking or maybe not. Like I said, this isn't talked about much. But if Jesus talked about it 4 times, then we need to pay attention. Whatever we do with the text, we can't just ignore it. Yeah, that's not an option. Okay, that's all I've got. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.